Prohibition doesn't eliminate the market for drugs. Okay? The rhetoric of some politicians, some policymakers, acts as though by passing a law, we can get rid of drug use, but of course that's blatantly false. Prohibition probably does have some effect in reducing drug use. The evidence would suggest small effects, but clearly huge markets remain, okay, despite the fact that we have quite severe penalties for selling drugs, for possessing drugs, and so on. Okay? So what prohibition does is it creates a black market. It creates an underground market in which people buy and sell drugs. And in that black market, a bunch of really unfortunate things happen. In the black market, we see far more violence than we would see if drugs were legal and transacted in legal markets. Why? Because black market suppliers and consumers for any good can't resolve their differences of opinion, their disputes, okay, with courts, with lawyers. They do so with guns because they're not allowed access to the legal dispute resolution system. Prohibition generates corruption. That's especially obvious in many sort of developing countries that are suppliers of drugs because, again, the people in the drug industry can't have ballot initiatives. They can't lobby Congress in the standard way that most businesses do. They engage in bribes to jurors, to police, to judges, and so on. Okay? Prohibition generates income-generating crime, theft, prostitution, and so on by forcing the prices of drugs to be much higher. Prohibition lowers quality control. So the people who continue to use drugs, despite prohibition, are clearly worse off. They don't know what dosage they're getting. They don't know what adulterants might be in the drugs. And of course, they face the risk of going to jail, which is one of the worst things that can happen to you, far worse than most kinds of simple use of even the strong illegal drugs. We get greater spread of HIV because of prohibition. Under prohibition, we don't give people easy access to clean needles. We force the price of drugs to be much higher, so people have a strong incentive to inject to get a big bang for the buck. Much of the spread of HIV in the last 20 years in the US has been the result of intravenous drug use, of sharing dirty needles. That's directly a result of prohibition. Because of prohibition, we have limitations on medical research. We have limitations on civil liberties, all sorts of extremely aggressive policies, such as knocking down doors without no-knock warrants and things like that, that sometimes put innocent people at great risk and more generally infringe on reasonable notions of civil liberties. We've created havoc in many supplier countries because we have pushed them to try to enforce the drug prohibition that we think is the good policy. And the list goes on. When you listen to that list, you think, gee, even if I really don't like drugs, even if I really wish everybody did not use drugs, there's got to be a better approach. The particular approach we're using now is just incredibly insane. So what's the alternative? The obvious alternative to economists is a sin tax. Sin tax, or some people get upset when I use the word sin because they think I'm disapproving of drugs. I'm just using the word sin tax because that's the common term. Compare a prohibition to a policy of simply imposing a relatively high tax rate, okay, on drugs, similar to what we do for alcohol and tobacco. Okay? Can show in a very straightforward way with standard economics that any increase in price and reduction in consumption that you can achieve via prohibition, you can also achieve, okay, with the appropriate size sin tax, assuming that you devote appropriate resources, roughly the same resources, to enforcing that prohibition, enforcing that sin tax as you were using to enforce that prohibition. So first, we've gotten about the same increase in price and the same reduction in consumption, but there's a crucial difference. With the sin tax, okay, government collects a lot of tax revenue, and the tax revenue is a transfer from people who purchase drugs to the general coffers. It can be used to build hospitals, it can be used for tax rebates, it can be used for other things. When we have prohibition, we force huge expenditures of resources on extra judges and jurors and prisons and so on, okay, in order to enforce, okay, the underground trade. We draw all sorts of resources into the production of drugs because it's done in a much more expensive way when it's driven underground. So we're clearly better off by enforcing the same increase in price and reduction in consumption that we've decided is appropriate if you accept that perspective, which I don't particularly, but if you wanted to do that, okay, by using the sin tax rather than by using the prohibition that we currently use. Perfect timing there. So the economic reasoning says, okay, maybe there's a case for some kinds of interventions to reduce some kinds of drug use in some circumstances, but no good case that there should be a general presumption that somebody sitting in his or her living room consuming drugs and not doing anything else to anybody should be interfered with in any way, shape, or form. Okay? So there's not a good case for us to intervene at all. If we're going to intervene at all, okay, we should be intervening in a way which achieves a good ratio of benefits to cost. The prohibitionist mentality just assumes that the only goal is reducing drug use. It doesn't think carefully about at what cost. And we are experiencing enormous cost in the attempt to achieve reductions in drug use and not achieving especially large reductions in drug use, if any. So we're mainly getting cost and very little benefit. Whatever benefit we are getting, we could get much more effectively with the taxation approach. Okay? So I just want to end by saying one more time, I think it's a tragedy that in a country that prides itself on a history of freedom and liberty, the burden of proof is now on the legalizers and not on the prohibitionist. Okay? The presumption should always be that people get to do what they want to do unless someone can show convincingly and compellingly and in a quantitatively important way that one person's exercise of individual choice, okay, is seriously inhibiting something else, somebody else's liberty, somebody else's ability to lead their own lives. And I don't think the prohibition argument has come anywhere close to meeting that burden of proof. Thank you.